Look, man, when you start digging into these old Hollywood stories about Sal Mineo and this idea that before he died, he supposedly talked about the secret relationships he had in that era, it blows your mind, not because of the gossip, but because of what it says about the entire system and how insanely controlled everything was back then. And I'm sitting here thinking, imagine trying to navigate fame in the 50s and 60s where you couldn't even be yourself because one rumor could end your entire career. And people today don't realize that the pressure wasn't subtle. It was brutal, like straight up psychological warfare. And when Joe Rogan, look at the way Hollywood operated in those days, it's like looking at a different species, man, because these studios literally owned you. They shaped you. They told you how to walk, how to talk, who to date, who to be seen with. And for a guy like Sal Mineo, who was talented, emotional, intense, and dealing with his own inner truth, it must have been like living inside a cage made of cameras and expectations. And when people now sensationalize this idea that he revealed names or had some kind of secret underground dating life with big Hollywood stars, the real shocking part isn't whatever names people think he said. The shocking part is the environment that forced everything underground in the first place, because people today forget that being openly gay in that era wasn't just risky. It was essentially career death. Like, you weren't just losing a job. The entire machine spit you out and acted like you never existed. And that fear shaped people's lives in ways modern audiences don't really grasp. And when you think about Sal trying to exist inside that, trying to be a full human being while also being molded and polished by a studio system that didn't even want actors to have real personalities, dude. It's heartbreaking. And the thing people should be talking about isn't some supposed scandalous list, but the psychological cost of hiding who you are for decades, the toll it takes to live inside a manufactured persona, the pressure of knowing that your career, your reputation, even your physical safety could be jeopardized by just being honest about who you love. And then you hear about these little bits of information he talked about later in life, these hints that he wasn't living as secretly anymore. And it makes sense, because at some point, a human being just breaks out of the cage and says, I want to breathe, even if the world around them isn't ready. And when we frame this stuff as shocking or scandalous, we're missing the point completely, because the truth is the not good part in that headline isn't about who he dated or didn't date. It's about the culture that forced entire generations of artists to live double lives. And dude, imagine being in love and having to pretend you don't even know the person in public. Imagine going to parties where everyone whispers about you, but nobody ever acknowledges anything openly. Imagine creating your art while also constantly running mental calculations about who's watching, who's judging, who might expose you, and then imagine the loneliness that grows inside you because you can't be your full self. And that's the story people should be telling, not some clickbait nonsense about hidden lovers, but the raw, painful reality of how oppressive Hollywood was back then, and honestly still can be. And when I think about Sal Mineo at the end of his life finally being more open, talking more freely, reflecting on the insane world he came up in, I don't hear a man trying to expose people. I hear a man trying to reclaim his own truth before time ran out, trying to be seen as a human being instead of a character invented by a studio boardroom. And if we really want to learn something from his story, it's that authenticity shouldn't be a luxury reserved for certain generations. It should be a basic human right. And the fact that an actor with his talent and heart had to hide so much just to survive, that's the part that isn't good. That's the tragedy people should be talking about, because behind all the lights and glamour was a world built on fear, secrecy, and control. And if anything about Sal Mineo shocks people today, it should be how courageously he lived despite all that, how he carved out a life in a system designed to crush individuality, how he finally spoke more freely, not to shame anyone, but to liberate himself. And if we're going to talk about him, let's talk about him with compassion and curiosity, not cheap gossip. Because the truth isn't that he had secrets, the truth is that he lived in a world where he wasn't allowed not to. And the thing that really gets me, man, when you keep pulling at this thread, this whole idea of Sal Mineo opening up near the end of his life and how people now twist that into some kind of scandal, is that it forces you to look deeper at how Hollywood culture didn't just shape careers, it literally shaped people's identities. And I sit there thinking, How many other actors from that era went to their graves with truths they never felt safe saying out loud? Because that's the real tragedy here. Not some imaginary list of lovers, but the fact that honesty itself was considered radioactive. And when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, you realize how this stuff becomes generational trauma baked into the industry. Like, these studios weren't just controlling scripts, they were controlling human beings, entire lives. And that creates this ripple effect that lasts decades. Because when you force one generation to hide, the next generation grows up thinking secrecy is the normal state of being, and then they pass it along, and suddenly you have an entire system built on pretending, on polishing, on suppression. And when I, Joe Rogan, talk about this on the podcast, people think we're just talking gossip or Hollywood mysteries. But it's way deeper than that. It's anthropology, it's psychology, it's a study of what happens when a society demands that its artists sacrifice realness in exchange for fame. And the thing about Sal Mineo's story is that it's like this cracked window into a world we weren't supposed to see, a place where some of the most creative people alive were forced into silence. And when you think about what that silence actually does to a person, how it eats at your self-esteem, how it rewires your brain, you start feeling sympathy, not curiosity, and it blows my mind that people still turn it into tabloid bait instead of asking the real questions, like, what does a life lived in secrecy do to someone's soul? How does it change the way they love? How does it affect the art they create? And you look at Sal's work, and there's this rawness, this vulnerability, this emotional honesty on screen that probably came from holding so much inside. And I always say this on my show: humans aren't built to hide fundamental pieces of themselves forever. It's like plugging a volcano. You can keep it contained for a while, but eventually something's going to crack. And maybe that's why he started opening up more later in life. Not to expose anyone, not to drop names or create drama, but because telling the truth is like breathing after being underwater too long. And the sad part is, he didn't get enough time to fully step into that honest version of himself. And the world didn't get to hear the deeper wisdom he would have shared if he'd lived longer. Because people who come out of pressure cooker systems like early Hollywood, they carry insight the rest of us don't have. They understand the cost of repression in a way we never will. And as you look at his final years, you see a man trying to reclaim the narrative of his own life, trying to break free from the ghosts of studio contracts and media expectations. And that's why when people today chase these narratives about secret relationships, they're missing the real gold, which is the human lesson beneath the rumors, that when you strip away the fame and the lights and the nostalgia, you have a guy who just wanted to be understood, who wanted to live honestly, who wanted to exist on his own terms for once. And when you look at that in the context of old Hollywood, it's almost revolutionary, because that world thrived on illusion, and anyone who even tried to break through that illusion was considered dangerous, unpredictable, uncontrollable, and the system didn't like that, man. And if you've ever wondered why so many people from that era struggled emotionally, mentally, or personally, it's because the human brain isn't meant to exist in a performance 24/7. And that's something I talk about all the time, performance versus authenticity. And the more we learn about that era, the more we see how damaging it was, how isolating it was, how unbelievably hard it must have been for people like Sal, who were navigating identities the world wasn't ready to accept. And when you fast forward to now, people pretend everything is more open and accepting. But the truth is, the entertainment industry still struggles with authenticity, still pressures people to hide certain things, still punishes those who break from the mold. And that's why these old stories matter, because they act like cautionary tales, reminders of how far we've come, but also how far we still have to go. And when you hear that Sal Mineo talked about his real experiences before he died, the healthiest way to interpret that isn't as gossip, but as bravery. A man finally pushing past decades of fear and control. And honestly, if he were alive today, I think he'd be talking about all the ways the industry needs to change, how creatives need space to be themselves without fear of losing everything, how hiding truth destroys people from the inside out. And that's why continuing this conversation matters. Not to dig up names, but to understand the conditions that created the secrecy in the first place. Because once you understand that, you stop seeing these stories as scandals and start seeing them as survival. And once you frame it that way, suddenly everything clicks, and you're like, damn, this wasn't about drama at all. This was about a guy trying to live in a world that didn't want him to exist fully. And that right there, man, that's the part that hits you because it forces you to reflect on how many people out there are still living like that today, still hiding, still scared, still shaped by someone else's expectations. And if hearing about Sal Mineo makes people even a little more empathetic, a little more aware of what authenticity costs in certain environments, then his story is doing something powerful, something meaningful, something way bigger than Hollywood ever intended. And what really blows my mind, man, when you keep following the emotional thread of Sal Mineo's life and everything he went through, is how his story becomes this mirror reflecting an entire era's psychological landscape. Because you start to see how the entertainment industry didn't just control the actors, it controlled the collective imagination of the public. And once you realize that, the whole conversation about his late life honesty becomes even more powerful. Because here's a guy who grew up inside a machine that told him what he was allowed to feel, what he was allowed to express, and even what parts of himself he had to bury just to survive. And yet near the end, he starts peeling back those layers, which to me feels like one of the most human things you can do. And that's why when people sensationalize it now, they're missing the deeper beauty of that moment, the courage it takes for someone who's been shaped by secrecy to finally speak openly. And I, Joe Rogan, look at that and see a guy who spent years wrestling with these invisible walls Hollywood built around him. And I think about how many conversations he might have had privately, maybe with friends, maybe with people he trusted, where he finally said things he'd never dared to say when he was younger. And not because he wanted to expose anyone, but because truth becomes addictive when you've been deprived of it. Like once you get a taste of real authenticity, you want more, you want it everywhere, and that's something people underestimate, the mental weight of living a constructed life. And you see it in modern celebrities too, but for someone in his era, the weight was multiplied by 1,000 because the rules were stricter, the tolerance was lower, and the fear was way more intense. And when he talked about his experiences, I imagine it wasn't about details or names. It was about finally acknowledging that the version of himself the world saw was only half the story. And that's the part that hits you hard, because how many of us walk around with parts of ourselves locked up out of fear? How many people today are still living versions of themselves filtered through someone else's expectations? And when you think about Sal Mineo in that context, you stop viewing him as just another actor from the past and start seeing him as a symbol of that universal struggle. Someone who carried the burden of performance long after the cameras stopped rolling. Someone who kept showing up even when the world tried to shrink him. And that's inspiring, man. That's heroic in a way people don't talk about enough. And when people now spin it as some shocking story about Hollywood's secret gay culture, they flatten the whole narrative into a headline, when the truth is much more complex and much more human. Because the real shock isn't the idea that queer people existed in early Hollywood. The real shock is how dangerous it was for them to exist openly, how much fear was baked into that world. And when Sal finally spoke more freely, it wasn't scandalous, it was healing, it was growth, it was a man reclaiming his own narrative in the face of decades of suppression. And that's the part modern audiences should pay attention to. Because think about how much courage it takes to challenge a system that's built on silence, especially when that system has already punished you for stepping outside the lines. And yet he did it anyway, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, moment by moment. And the more you learn about him, the more you realize he wasn't trying to shock anyone. He was trying to free himself. And if we look at it that way, his story becomes less about Hollywood mysteries and more about emotional survival, a reminder that human beings aren't meant to live in cages, especially cages built from fear and shame. And the saddest part is he didn't get enough time to fully step into that freedom, because who knows what kind of wisdom he would have shared if he'd lived longer, about identity, about authenticity, about the cost of fame, about the things people sacrifice just to fit into a role someone else chose for them. And when you think about that, man, it really forces you to examine how much of our own society still runs on curated versions of reality, especially now with social media turning everyone into their own little PR machine. And it makes you appreciate someone like Sal, who, even in the final chapters of his life, started choosing truth over image. And that's a powerful reminder that no matter how long you've lived inside a persona, there's always a chance to step out of it, always a moment where you can reclaim the pieces of yourself you buried, always a way to rewrite your own story. And maybe that's why people still talk about him. Maybe that's why his name still shows up in conversations about old Hollywood, because he represents something bigger than gossip or scandal. He represents the struggle for authenticity in an industry built on illusion, the fight for personal truth in a world obsessed with surface-level narratives. And honestly, that's why I think his story resonates with people even decades later, because deep down, everyone understands what it feels like to hide something, to fear judgment, to carry a truth that scares you. And when they see someone like him starting to break free from that, even late in life, it hits something universal, something relatable, something timeless. And if anything from his story shocks people today, it shouldn't be the rumors. It should be the courage, the resilience, the humanity, because that's where the real impact is. That's where the lessons are. That's where the heart of the story lives. And that's why continuing this conversation matters. Not to dig into anyone's personal life, but to understand the cost of hiding and the power of revealing who you truly are, even if the world isn't ready. And the more you trace the emotional arc of Sal Mineo's journey, man, the more you start realizing that what he went through wasn't just an individual struggle. It was a blueprint of what happens when a system values image over humanity. And every time I, Joe Rogan, dive deeper into stories like his, I can't help but think about how many layers of silence were stacked onto people from that era. How many actors and artists were basically taught from day one that vulnerability was a threat, honesty was a liability, and authenticity was something you practiced only in private, if at all. And when you picture him at the end of his life, finally opening up more, finally allowing himself to feel and express things he'd spent decades hiding, it becomes this incredibly raw, incredibly human moment that has nothing to do with exposing anyone and everything to do with reclaiming his voice. Because when you have lived under that kind of pressure for so long, speaking the truth becomes a radical act, almost like breaking a spell. And that's why it frustrates me when modern retellings turn his late life conversations into some kind of scandal, when really what people should be focusing on is the emotional liberation behind those moments, the psychological release that comes when someone who's been restrained for years finally gets to breathe without fear. And it makes you wonder how differently things might have gone if Hollywood back then had allowed people to be whole human beings instead of curated products. Because the more you think about it, the more you see how that old system didn't just create stars. It created prisons, emotional prisons, disguised as careers, and Sal was one of those people who lived inside that contradiction, celebrated on screen but constrained behind the scenes, living a life where every word had to be carefully measured, every relationship had to be evaluated for risk, every room you walked into required you to put on a mask before you crossed the threshold. And that's the part that breaks your heart, man, because no one should have to live like that. No one should have to trade their identity for acceptance. But that was the cost of fame in that era. And when people wonder why so many stories from old Hollywood sound tragic or chaotic or haunted, it's because the industry didn't give people space to be real, and human beings don't do well when they're forced to hide fundamental parts of themselves. And when Sal started being more open later in life, I see that as a sign of growth, not gossip, healing rather than controversy. And I think that's why his story still hits people today, because it's not just about him, it's about the universal battle between who we are and who the world tells us to be. And every person listening knows that feeling on some level, even if their circumstances are totally different, because we all shrink sometimes. We all hide parts of ourselves to fit into spaces that weren't built for us. And when you see someone like him finally pushing back against that pressure, even after decades of living inside a system that demanded silence, it reminds you that reclaiming your truth is always possible, no matter how late in the game it might be. And that's a powerful message, especially now in a world where everyone's trying to brand themselves online, where everyone's curating a version of themselves for public consumption, where authenticity is preached constantly but practiced rarely, because the fear of judgment hits just as hard today as it did then. Even if the consequences aren't as extreme, the psychological mechanics are the same. And that's why studying stories like his matters, because they're not relics. They were warnings about what happens when society prizes illusion above honesty. And the more we understand what people like Sal endured, the more we can prevent that same cycle from repeating in modern forms, whether it's through social media pressure or career expectations or cultural conditioning. And when you put all these pieces together, what emerges isn't a headline about secret relationships, but a portrait of a man who fought to exist authentically inside a world that didn't want him to, who started reclaiming pieces of his identity one truth at a time, who carried the weight of decades of silence and still found the strength to start speaking openly before it was too late. And that's what people should remember. His courage, his resilience, his humanity, not the myths or rumors or sensationalism that people cling to because it's easier than facing the real uncomfortable truth about how society treated people like him. And when you frame it that way, the whole narrative shifts, and suddenly his story becomes a call to action, a reminder to question the systems we participate in, to challenge the expectations placed on us, to examine the walls we build around ourselves, and most importantly, to value the kind of honesty he fought so hard to reach. Because at the end of the day, that's the lesson his life leaves behind, that authenticity isn't just a luxury, it's a necessity. It's oxygen, and when it's taken away, people suffocate slowly, quietly, invisibly, even when the world thinks they're thriving, and when he finally let himself speak more freely, even in small moments, even in private conversations. That wasn't scandalous, it was heroic. And if there's anything from his journey that deserves attention today, it's that quiet bravery, that human fight to be seen, not the gossip people try to attach to his name.